So thanks everyone for joining us today. It is my pleasure to introduce Peter. He is a professor in mathematics at Case Western Reserve University. His research mainly focuses on theoretical biophysics, mathematical and computational neuroscience, specifically stochastic phenomena arising in neurodynamics. So today he will share some of the related work about dimension reduction for stochastic oscillators. So Peter, feel free to start.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as I was telling the organizers earlier, I have probably more material than fits comfortably into the allotted time. And so what I'll do is I'll give a little bit of the setup for the kinds of problems I want to talk about. And then we can pick and choose what's most of interest to everybody in the audience. I'd love to have questions at any point. So however Ying wants to handle that, if you send them to her and she asks questions, or if you just jump in, it looks like it's a nice, cozy group. So I'm delighted to be keeping this informal. Okay, so yeah, the topic is phase reduction for stochastic oscillators. Everything I talk about today is work that I've developed together with Benjamin Lindner at Humboldt University and the Brandeis Center for Computational Neuroscience. This has been a wonderful collaboration, and I want to give him full credit. And several students have been involved who I'll mention along the way. So, whoops, there we go. So what do I mean by dimension reduction? We are interested in high-dimensional, noisy, nonlinear phenomena. Pretty much most of what's interesting in mathematical biology involves some combination of those pathologies. And very often what we're trying to do is find a lower dimensional description of whatever the phenomenon of interest is, so that we can get some insight into mechanisms or you know, what's really going on. And so a classic example of finding a lower dimensional description is phase reduction. If you can take a high dimensional oscillator and describe it or capture its key features of its behavior using a one-dimensional description, then you've gained a lot of ground on the problem. And so a tremendous amount has been understood about how oscillators can be entrained, or how networks of oscillators synchronize with each other through this phase reduction approach over the years. Now, recently there's been a lot of activity in augmented phase reduction. I'm not going to be talking about that, but I want to, for anybody who's interested in this literature, Youngman's involved in some of this, Dan Wilson, Barderman Trout, and there's a really rapidly growing literature where you look at not just the phase, but maybe the leading Floquet coordinate that tells you what's happening in the directions transverse limit cycle. I'm not going to be talking about that at all, but I will point out that it's an interesting problem how to extend the stuff I am going to talk about, which is how you handle phase reduction when your oscillators are noisy. Nobody has extended that to the case where you look at the behavior transverse to the limit cycle. So I think just in terms of, if you're a graduate student looking for a nice problem, tackling the isostable or augmented phase reduction problem for stochastic oscillators, that would be a really cool thing to accomplish, which I'm also working on. So, I mean, I guess we're competing, but I'd love to get the answer. At this point in my career, I don't have to be the first one. I just, I want to know how it fits together. All right, so with that side remark, oscillators are everywhere. In a mathematical biology seminar, I probably don't have to spend as much time convincing you of that as I would maybe in a general mathematics seminar. These are just a few examples, some from our work, some from other people's work. If you look at individual cells like spiking neurons, or you look at populations of nerve cells, or you look at the heart or respiration or locomotion, pretty much everywhere you look, there are rhythmic behaviors. And a good chunk of what we do in mathematical biology is we construct systems of differential equations to try and explain what they're doing and how they interact. Now in nature, most of these are actually noisy, although, you know, we like to start with ordinary differential equations because they're easier to understand. And so basically what I'm talking about today is how do we go beyond that in terms of phase reduction. But first I need to explain a bit about what phase reduction is. I know there are 15 participants, and I know who 3 of you are. The rest of you, I'm going to assume that you are first-year graduate students who maybe are in the middle of your first dynamical systems course, and you wouldn't mind a quick refresher. If that's incorrect, and like the rest of you are Tim Lewis and John Rubin, then please tell me, and I'll skip this part. And Tom can let me know. Okay, he's giving me the thumbs up that I should. Yeah. Okay. So here's the basic picture, and I stole this shamelessly from stuff that Youngman did. As I'm proud to say, he got his start in this business as my master's student. Then he went on to greener pastures and worked with Bard Ehrmantraut. But this is a couple of these next slides are from a review paper or chapter that he did with Bard on the utility of phase models for studying synchronization. So here's a vector field, this F here, from a conductance-based neural model. It's a simplified version of something like the Hodgkin Huxley system. You've got ion channels that open and close. You've got a membrane potential that goes up and down. And when the voltage goes up and down, that influences the way that the ion channels in the membrane open and close. And of course, when they're open, they let in a current, and that influences the voltage. So you've got these two variables interacting with each other, and you end up with a planar system that produces a stable limit cycle. If you plot just the voltage component over time, you get something that looks like what you would record experimentally. So a train of spikes. And W is the recovery variable, or the representing the state of the ion channels. And so if you plot V and W together, you get this nice oscillatory pattern. You can see my little pointer moving around. Okay, is that coming through? Or yeah, okay, good. All right, so phase reduction for a system like this would mean converting the two-dimensional system into a one-dimensional representation by introducing a change of coordinates, where we introduce a variable theta or phi, with the property that at every point in the entire plane, theta at that point is evolving at a constant rate. So the voltage is going up and down, in this complicated way. The limit cycle is going around in some complicated nonlinear way. But if you just plot theta as a function of time, it's like a clock. And so we found a change of coordinates where we can measure what fraction of the limit cycle we have traversed up at any given point in time. And if we're off the limit cycle, we're going to converge to the limit cycle, and we're going to converge to a particular limit cycle solution that is indexed by where it lies on the limit cycle relative to other solutions on the limit cycle. So that way we can define the phase for points in the basin of attraction of the limit cycle. And if we plot the phase, then it's increasing at a constant rate. Of course, when we get to once around the circle, we drop back down to 0. So we have these instantaneous, these discontinuous jumps, because we're just taking it mod. In this case, we're taking theta mod the period of the oscillator. We can imagine taking the set of points that, as the trajectory flows forwards in time, would converge to the limit cycle and converge to exactly the same point. So all these points along this white set, it's a set transverse, cutting across transverse to the flow. It's a Poincare section, and it's called an isochron, meaning equal time, because all the points here are going to have identical timing behavior in the future. So they're all going to converge around to as you move around to the limit cycle, and they're going to stick together. So after one bit of time, this white stripe is going to turn into the black stripe, which is going to turn into the gray stripe, etc. Okay. This notion of isochrons, which is key to the reducing the dimension of the description of the oscillator down to a single phase variable, goes back to a classic paper in 1975 by John Kuchenheimer, who formulated the notion of isochrons in 2 different ways. So these 2 different ways turn out to be equivalent if you're talking about ordinary differential equations, but when you have stochastic differential equations, they are similar but not equivalent anymore, and they lead to 2 different ways of defining what do you mean by the asymptotic phase if you've got a noisy oscillator. So I'm going to give you both definitions. We won't go through the whole detail unless anybody wants to do that. But the basic idea is you can ask for all the points that will, as time goes to infinity, converge not only to the limit cycle, but converge to each other on the limit cycle. And any such set of points is a set of points that has the same asymptotic phase. the phase is the value on the limit cycle, and the asymptotic phase is the value of the limit cycle that you converge to. So that's where the name asymptotic phase comes from. And so you can collect those points, and that gives you a notion of the isochrons. Or you can just say, I would like to find a set of points, a Poincare section with the property that if I move forwards in time, starting from any of those points, I go forwards in time by exactly one period of the oscillator. So I go around once and I come back one period later. I want to end up with the points one period later contained in a subset of the points that I started. So this also gives you a notion of isochron. The two notions are equivalent, but one of them is asking for how do you identify points based on the behavior that they show as time goes to infinity, and the other is based on what happens one period later, or what happens locally. I want a set of these surfaces so that all the points on this section end up a short time later on the next section, and so on. So one of them is defined in terms of the asymptotic behavior. One is sort of the local timing behavior. All right. Now, unfortunately, so this is a beautiful concept, and it's been very fruitful for the field, but it completely falls apart as soon as you have noisy systems. And since all oscillators in biology are at some level fundamentally actually noisy, this is in a way a sort of a conceptual problem for the whole field. Just to illustrate what I mean, so suppose this is another conductance-based model. This one is one I implemented from Itzikevich. He has a nice book, Dynamical Systems in Neuroscience. It's a good place for beginners who are interested in this field. If I take a bunch of initial conditions on the same isochron, which I've denoted here by using the same colors, so red, yellow, green, and so on. If you let things move forwards in time, this one converges pretty quickly. After a period or so, they've converged. You can almost not see them spread out anymore. They've converged so rapidly. So these red points a period later have all converged to that. The orange points have converged to this, and so on. On the other hand, if you take into account the fact that the potassium channels that comprise this auxiliary variable, the one complementary to the voltage, is actually a bunch of two-state Markov processes randomly opening and closing with transition rates that are governed by the voltage. Now you have a stochastic version of this oscillator based on the underlying biophysics, and you take a bunch of points with the same initial conditions, I mean, on the same isochrons, but what you find is they smear out over time. The noise spreads things out. So everything converges pretty rapidly to the limit cycle, although not perfectly because the noise is pushing you around. There's some regions where you're much more spread out than others. You can see the colors have kind of stayed together, but if you go on for sufficiently long, the diffusion effect, so to speak, will happen in the phase variable, and you'll get spread around so that every initial condition converges to the same stationary probability distribution, and no initial conditions converge to each other pathwise. If you look at the individual trajectories, nothing converges to anything because it's stochastic. So the definition where I ask for isochrons in terms of what is if I look at what the behavior of a point as time goes to infinity, find all the points that converge to each other. Well, there aren't any points that converge to each other because everything is doing its own. If everything is driven with independent noise, then nothing converges to anything else. If I drive everything with the same noise, that's a different story, and then the whole thing converges to a single point, and that's a different kind of problem. If I ask for a surface with the property that every point starting on that surface, if I go around by one period, it comes back and hits the same surface at exactly the same time, that's not going to happen because everything is random. The time when any one point, I can take multiple points from the same starting location, and they're going to hit the same surface at different times. So both of these definitions are problematic, and essentially, if you get nothing else from the talk, Benjamin and I and our students have solved this problem, at least at the level of how how can you introduce a conceptual notion of the phase that actually works in the stochastic setting and is consistent with the deterministic setting. So we feel like we've done that. I mean, there's a lot more to do because then we want to study synchronization, entrainment, phase response curves, and all of that within the new framework. But that's that's material for future grant proposals and so on. All right, so there are these two basic notions of how you define the phase in the deterministic case, which in that case are equivalent. And I've got a story to tell about each of them. What I think I'll do is, since the day is still young, I'll give you the basic story about how we generalize each of these pictures to the noisy case. And then after that, there are some applications and like interesting consequences that's in our more recent work. So I'll continue maybe till the bottom of the hour with sort of the setup for each of these, and then I'll ask what you're most interested in, and we can have a pick and choose what to do with the rest of the time. Okay, so these two different approaches. One is based on pathwise properties, so that's the sort of looking just a short time into the future, and then another is based on looking at the asymptotic behavior at long times in the future. And what I'll do with what I'll start with first is I'll look at the generalization of the phase in terms of a long-term asymptotic point of view, which is something that Benjamin and I originated. The other thing, the other approach actually originated at about the same time. They were a year earlier by Arkady Pikovsky at Potsdam University. And then what Benjamin and I have done is sort of taken their heuristic point of view and made it mathematically rigorous. So, and that's a paper that just came out this year. So we'll get to both of those. All right, so in both cases, we're gonna move from the deterministic ordinary differential equations picture to a stochastic differential equations picture. A lot of what I talk about goes even beyond a sort of a Gaussian white noise kind of stochastic picture for things like we can incorporate jump Markov processes and so on. But it's a little bit easier to describe the setup if I just have the usual sort of Langevin or white noise driving. So that's the way I'm going to set it up here. So before we had something like dx dt equals f of x. If I'm thinking about a random process, at least if I'm talking to a math audience, we rewrite this in terms of the increments of a Wiener process where the noise is coming from, so if you're familiar with Brownian motion, if I take the increment, the random Gaussian step of Brownian motion over a small window of time, that's a model for white noise, and that's our dW here. And since the Wiener process, you can't take its derivative, we try to avoid writing dW dt, and we write it this way. So this is an Ito differential equation that has to do with how you interpret the stochastic integrals, and I won't get into it in today's talk. Fascinating dichotomy though. So A, here's the vector field. This is what I called F before. So if I didn't have any noise, I would just write dx dt equals A times x. But then we've got the noise, and the noise is affecting the various components in some way that could combine different noise sources. So we have this noise matrix B. BB transpose is going to show up a lot when we write down an equation for how the density evolves. So I define that here. And all right, so the basic problem with interpreting the phase in the earlier definitions is that the trajectories don't behave very nicely. But the density, the ensemble of trajectories does behave in a very nice way. And so part of the answer to the problem is to describe things in terms of either the density rather than individual trajectories, or in the other approach, look at the things like the average time it takes to get around, to look at moments of the distribution. All right, so here's what I mean by the density. This is the probability that our trajectory is in the vicinity of a location of a point y at some future time t, given that it started at a point x at an earlier time s, which is written in a fancy way over here. This density obeys two different linear partial differential equations. One in physics is called the forward equation, and the other is called the backward equation. The forward equation tells you how the probabilities evolve in time. So this is a sort of a drift diffusion or advection convection diffusion equation. So there's a term involving the velocity that pushes, if you've got a certain probability density, velocity pushes it around, but also the noise is tending to make things spread out. So if you think of your basic heat equation where the diffusion process is just making things spread out, that would be something that looks like this term with the second derivatives in it. Within a certain natural Hilbert space, if you take the formal adjoint of this operator, you get the backwards operator. Probabilists call this the generator of the Markov process. It's related to this transition density if I differentiate with respect to the initial time. So I'm sort of looking backwards in time. It's not an evolution equation. It doesn't tell me how the probability evolves backwards in time, but I can use it to tell me how an observable would change forwards in time. And those of you who have caught wind of all this excitement about Koopmanism, the Koopman operator, this is equivalent to the Koopman operator. It's basically, if you took an observable like the phase, the time until something happens, you know, the value of the voltage, the mean value of the voltage, something like that. The way that an observable changes forwards in time is given by applying this operator to it. The way the probability evolves forward in time is given by applying the other operator. So we have these two different operators, and I'm going to call them the forward and backward operators. So we're going to make a big leap here, but it's borne out by our numerical work, which is that I'm going to assume that both of these operators can be diagonalized. They have well-defined eigenvalues. They have a, you know, an orthogonal decomposition in terms of eigenfunctions. And I'm going to call the eigenfunctions of the forward operator P. So with eigenvalue lambda, that's P lambda. And the eigenfunctions for the backwards operator, I'm going to call Q. So with, you have to take the complex conjugate. So Q star lambda is the thing that matches, has the eigenvalue matching P lambda. They have this biorthogonality relation. So if I take two of them, I'm normalized the Q's so that the integral of Q star times P gives me 1. If I use mismatched eigenvalues, then they're orthogonal. And we're assuming that we can write the transition probability as a sum with these with the spectral decomposition. The 0th eigenvalue, or the leading eigenvalue, is 0, which just corresponds to the steady state. So the forward eigenfunction is the steady state probability distribution, and the backwards eigenfunction is just identically 1 everywhere for that one. And then the rest, you know, one can try to compute them numerically. Okay, so the idea is, if some basic conditions are satisfied, namely that, so the first eigenvalue is always going to be 0. All the other eigenvalues are going to have negative real parts because everything is, the probability density is converging to a stable, you know, to a stationary distribution. And so all the other eigenvalues have negative real part. If the thing acts like an oscillator, then the way that it approaches the stationary distribution, the slowest decaying eigenvalue, or the slowest decaying mode, will be a complex conjugate pair with a negative real part and an imaginary part that gives me is related to the frequency of oscillation that you see as you're approaching. So right. So imagine you know those swimming pools where there's a continuous flow current that goes in a circle, like you find at fancy. When I spent my sabbatical in Germany, every single water park has these things. In the US, they're like, you find them occasionally. They're really cool. So there's this current of water going around in a big annulus. You take a big container of rubber ducks in there, and you let it go right at one spot, and you watch what happens. So now this is a noisy oscillator, right? The ducks are going around, but they're spreading out because, you know, the water is jostling them. And if you come back like a week later, you'll see the rubber ducks are all uniformly distributed, right? They're just going around and around, having a great time. So that's the stationary, that's the asymptotic behavior. But if you come back like, you know, an hour later, it won't be completely uniform because there'll still be like a hump of the ducks kind of that didn't spread out as much as the others. And so there will be a local maximum that's moving around, but gradually decaying, you know, spreading out to the asymptotic distribution. If I take the difference between the stationary distribution and then the actual distribution as time goes along, it will have the form of a decaying sinusoid times some spatial function. That's the slowest decaying mode. That's the eigenmode I'm talking about here. It's like the pattern of the rubber ducks on their way to oblivion and the heat death of the swimming pool. Okay, so in order for our framework to work, we have to have this leading eigenvalue, non-trivial eigenvalue, has to be complex. It has to be oscillating faster than it decays. Like if they decay really fast, then you don't see a sort of a measurable oscillation. That just means that omega over mu has to be large. This ratio is also what in some literature is called the quality factor of a noisy oscillator. So we have to have a good quality noisy oscillator. And we want the other eigenmodes to decay fast enough that we can sort of ignore them, that they don't really complicate things. And this third condition we just invented, not really knowing what we were doing. We just asserted that the next slowest decaying eigenvalue had to be at least twice as negative as in real part as the primary one. It turns out that so one story I could tell in the second half of the talk, if you would like, is that if I take a linear system that is decaying towards a spiral fixed point, so I just have the simplest kind of like a two-dimensional Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process that's rotating towards a spiral sink. It is well known, and I can explain why if this is not familiar. It's well known that you cannot define the asymptotic phase reduction for a spiral sink. You have to have a nonlinear system with a limit cycle, because all the different points converge together, and so you can't disambiguate initial conditions based on the convergence behavior. But if you add noise, it is completely different. If you add noise to a spiral sink, you get a sustained oscillation. Its coherence waxes and wanes, but you get a nice peak in the power spectrum that isn't there if you don't have the noise. So there is a characteristic frequency, and you have sort of a measurable oscillation. And you can calculate analytically the eigenvalue, the eigenfunctions and eigenvalues of the forward and backward operator in the case where the flow is linear. And it's exactly this border case. That is to say, you have the stationary distribution, then you've got the slowest decaying eigenmode, which is just one of the Hermite functions, and then you've got the next slowest decaying mode, which is another one of the Hermite functions, which has real part exactly twice as small as the real part for the slowest decaying mode. So we have a paper that came out last year in Physical Review E, where we calculated analytically what all the isochrons for both the forward and backward operator are for the spiral sink with noise. Okay, so you actually can define the asymptotic phase for a spiral sink if it's noisy, if it's a quasi-cycle. Okay, so anyway, that's one story I could flesh out if you're interested. But so to finish this sort of introductory part, this complicated looking statement here is essentially the statement that if I take the distribution and I subtract off the long-term behavior and I look at what's left, the behavior is a sinusoid that is decaying exponentially. So mu here is the real part, which is negative, the real part of the slowest decaying eigenvalue. So I have this exponential decaying envelope, and under that envelope, I've got an oscillatory process with the frequency given by the period of oscillation of the underlying limit cycle, or whatever the density, the oscillation of the density. So this is the imaginary part of the eigenvalue. And then there's these two constants. One is related to the initial condition, and one is related to the future position, and they give a phase offset. This phase offset that is related to the way that changing the initial condition shifts the phase of this decaying oscillation, that thing is the asymptotic phase of the stochastic oscillator. And it turns out to be the same as the traditional phase if you let the noise go down to zero. So this phase offset, the one that depends on x, the initial condition, that shows up when you write the backward eigenfunction for the slowest decaying eigenmode as a magnitude u times e times the polar component. So the thing that we are calling the asymptotic phase is the complex argument of the slowest decaying eigenmode of the backwards eigenfunction. And there's also the forward eigenfunction, which does not have such a natural interpretation, and so we don't say that much about it. So I'm going to skip over. I'm not going to say too much more. Let me see. All right. So this is now let's look at an example system for a moment. This is a nice example to test these ideas in because it's a system that has an oscillator in it, but the oscillator only oscillates if there's noise. So this is a heteroclinic cycle. We invented this ourselves and then belatedly found it in chapter 10 of Hirsch, Smale, and Devaney's textbook. So there really is nothing new under the sun. But so it's a nice example of a heteroclinic oscillator. So what's happening is I have a vector field where I have an unstable spiral source in the middle. I spiral around, and I have a saddle point here, 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 and here. I have 4 saddles. The unstable manifold of this saddle coincides with the stable manifold of that saddle. So there's a trajectory where I can start at this point as time goes to minus infinity, course along here, approach this point as time goes to plus infinity, and never get around. So if I do that 4 times, right? So that's now 4 times infinity. That's the period of this cycle. So there's no finite period limit cycle. But if I add noise, then I don't get stuck in the corner. If I add noise and say reflecting boundary conditions, so I stay inside this square, then I move around with a finite period, and it behaves like an oscillator. And in fact, so here you are without noise and with noise, right? You get stuck, you don't get stuck. So our way of defining the asymptotic phase, actually, and as well as the other version that I'll get to in a moment, they both work in this system as well as in a system where there is an underlying limit cycle oscillator. What you find in the literature previously is that people were interested in things like phase response curves for noisy oscillators. They would start with an oscillator that already has a stable limit cycle without any noise, and then they would add a small amount of noise and perturb the trajectories and talk about how, you know, the phase evolution became noisy and so on. But here, if you take away the noise, there isn't any oscillator at all, and we think it's a strength of our framework that you can talk about the phase in this case as well, which you couldn't if you just had the sort of classic approach. It's a nice oscillator. Benjamin and I calculated its power spectrum, which is tricky since it's getting the power spectrum analytically for a nonlinear oscillator is pretty involved. But we did some asymptotic analysis and we're able to construct it. So the point is, it has a nice peak in the power spectrum. So here's a thought experiment that illustrates this idea of the rubber ducks in the circular pool. We choose a point, so we run a long trajectory, we choose a point. Every time you hit that point, we say, okay, conditioned on having reached this point, where was I at a certain time earlier? Or to put it another way, when was I last at this location, given that I'm now at this location? Or when was I last at this other location, given that I'm at this location? So we ask for the conditional density of times in the past, given the observation in the future. And this is like, if you think about what does the asymptotic phase mean? You're asking for the initial conditions that would have converged to a single point in the limit cycle. That's how you define the phase, is by taking up where I am now and asking for the points, the distribution of points that I would have been before. This is doing the same thing, except we're doing it with densities instead of with individual points. And if I take these 2 different points, in either case, I see a decaying oscillation as I look further and further back in time that approaches the uniform distribution, because we're sampling it from equilibrium conditions. But there's a phase shift, and that phase shift we can calculate, pull out numerically. And our theory predicts that it should be the same as the complex argument of the eigenfunction, the slowest decaying eigenfunction of the operator. So here's the operator, the backwards operator for that heteroclinic oscillator system. We numerically use some tricks that Benjamin was particularly good at to pull out the eigenfunctions numerically and the eigenvalues. You see the eigenvalue spectrum for 2 different levels of noise here, and sure enough, the eigenvalue spectrum looks like we expect. There's an eigenvalue at 0 and then a complex conjugate pair. If I have more noise, if I make the noise larger, then this complex conjugate pair shifts to the left, so the rate of decay towards the stationary distribution is accelerated. Okay, but so in either case, we're looking at the slowest decaying complex conjugate pair. We pull out the eigenfunction that goes with that, and we plot it as a surface. We plot the complex argument as a surface. The blue dots are the phase estimated from this numerical experiment where we do this sampling over a long trajectory, and then the red hatched surface is the phase obtained from the eigenfunction, and it's a darn good match for both noise levels. there's not many samples at the middle because with small noise, you don't visit the middle very often. You can plot the level curves of the eigenfunctions. So again, red is the high noise and black is the low noise case, and they look like this. And so these are the isochrons for a noisy oscillator that doesn't have isochrons if there isn't any noise. And one thing to point out is that the more the noise, the less tightly curved the isochrons are. So the noise kind of smooths them out, which is not too surprising, but also isn't something we understand analytically very well yet. We'd like to be able to prove that increasing the noise always smooths out the isochrons, but we don't know how to do that yet. Okay, well, so that was the first story. The second story, and so then the thing that we can pick and choose is now, probably I should stop and ask you, I could give the theoretical background for the other half of the story, which is defining the phase, not in terms of the spectral decomposition, but in terms of the mean first passage time between one surface and another surface. So there's a nice story there. The asymptotic phase story that I just introduced, one of the cool things about it is that it applies to a linear spiral sink. So I could explain that. And the other thing that we could choose from is the mean return time story, which I haven't told yet. It has a very recent application, which is stuff that's just being published this month, and some of which is not published yet, where we can use that to calculate in an analytic way what the variance of the interspike interval of a noisy nerve cell is. Okay, so if you think of the interval between spikes as the transit time between sections, if you can calculate not only the mean return time to a section, but the variance of that return time, then you can solve the problem of the variance of interspike intervals, which is something that I don't think there's been a good analytical approach to until now. So we have, I guess that's two choices. Is either I jump to the spiral sink case and skip the mean return time, and then we have more time for questions, or I can explain the mean return time business, which is maybe more fundamental, and then we see what time it is at that point. So what's your pleasure, Ying or Tom or anybody else? There is a comment in the chat. Pathwise properties would be cool. Okay, yeah. From Jan Hendrik Schleimer, who has crashed this talk from Berlin. Okay, well, all right. Topic 1 or 3. What was what was one? Of the 3 things that I mentioned. Okay. Well, we have to talk about the mean return time to get to the variance. All right. So here's what I'll do. I'll skip the spiral sink story, and I'll try to introduce the mean return time briefly, and then show you some of the results for the variance of interspike intervals. Okay. All right, good. And I get the thumbs up from Tom again. Okay, good. So a year before Benjamin and I introduced this solution to the problem of how do you define the phase for a stochastic oscillator, Eustace Schwabedal and Pikovsky had already solved the problem in a different way a year before. And there's a nice exchange where they tell us our method is wrong. There's a bunch of comments back and forth published in Physical Review Letter, which is getting into an argument with somebody is a great way to get like a whole stack of Physical Review Letters on your CV, right? Because you just keep on like criticizing each other. It's all in good fun though. So here's their idea. The Poincare section is the second way of defining the asymptotic phase. And to remind you, I want a family of Poincare sections with a property that if I take any initial condition on the section, I go around one period, I hit that section exactly somewhere else on that section. Well, since things are stochastic, that's too much to ask for. But what if you just insisted that the mean time to come around and hit the section was the same? So that's what they suggested. And they did an interesting, a lovely and impressive numerical study where they have a bunch of different stochastic oscillators. And what they do is they start with like a candidate section, and then they run a large ensemble of simulations. And if I come back and I hit that section like earlier in one place and later in another place on average, then I move the joints in my little spline construction forwards or backwards until I try to solve iteratively an optimization problem where I want the mean return time from the section back to itself to be uniform. And Eustace told me it was so much work to get this going, he would never touch this problem again. He actually refused to confirm one of our predictions, to compare the two methods, because he said it was too difficult. So, but it's a lovely idea. So you see here an example where the red dots that go across here, that's one Poincare section. The green dots are another Poincare section. If you plot the mean time to get from the green section back to the green section as a function of where you start along the section, it's pretty much uniform for the green one, and it's not at all uniform for the red one. Okay, so the green one would be an isochron or an isophase section according to their criterion, and the red one would not. Okay, so we thought that this looked a lot like a first passage time problem, which is a well-known kind of problem in applied mathematics, where you have a stochastic process and you're asking, how long will it take until something happens, like until I get absorbed? In general, the time from a starting location, the average time until I hit an absorbing boundary, that's an observable. The average time until something happens is always decreasing at rate 1 by definition, right? Like how much time is it till the universe ends? It doesn't matter that you don't know when the universe ends. Like you're 1 second closer to whatever that time is every second that goes by. So the rate of change of the expected time until something happens is -1, but that's also equal to the backwards operator or the generator of the Markov process applied to the function. If there's an absorbing set, then the time left until you reach that set is 0 if you're already on the set. And then you need special adjoint reflecting boundary conditions on the domain, on the edge of the domain. So for example, the usual setup is, suppose I want to ask how long does it take until I bump into the wall on this particular segment. So the time t would be 0 there, and it would be, I would use reflecting boundary conditions everywhere else. And then in the interior, I'm solving this equation, which is a partial differential equation that you can implement numerically. Now, the problem that we have here, though, is that the section that we want is the isochron that we want to find is a surface with a property that if I start from that and I go around once, then I hit the same, I hit that surface at a time that's equal to the mean period, because the mean period we can calculate through other means, how long it takes to go around. But if I just set up this PDE and I set the solution equal to 0 here, right? If the question is, I start there, I go around once, and then but I started there, so right, so I'm already there. And so if I just set it boundary conditions equal to 0 along a strip, then I'm not going to get what I want. I'm not going to get the answer because you know, if I'm just to the left of it, the answer shouldn't be close to 0. It should be close to 1 full period. And if I sort of take the limit back and even cross it, if I haven't gone around once, I should get a period more than 0, not just 0. Okay, so what ought to happen is that the solution to this problem ought to have a discontinuous jump. But wherever my isochron is, you know, like I could take my cut at different places and I ought to have a jump somewhere, but I'm not sure where, right? So I don't know where the isochron is, so how do I get started on the problem? Conceptually, it's like this. It's another water park analogy. So you have the water slide that goes around and around, and you know, if you can be at the same position but one rotation lower, and the stochastic process could maybe swim backwards like a salmon going upstream, but it's not very likely. So so we initially thought of solving the PDE on this kind of a surface, and then fortunately we discovered you didn't have to do that. So what we were able to do, and now I'm going to skip a lot of stuff because, okay, so you can write down the same PDE, and it turns out you can take an arbitrary cut impose a jump condition across that cut of one period, impose adjoint reflecting boundary conditions everywhere else, you have to have an annular shaped domain. That is to say, you have to be able to cut a hole out in the middle, which is implicit in the construction that Pikovsky and Schwabedal did. And then when you solve the PDE, the solution you get, you can take it, mod the period, and that cut you imposed goes away. Like, it doesn't matter. You could have made the cut anywhere you like and you get the same function up to an additive constant, an additive offset, and mod the period. So we proved this. We use properties of strongly elliptic second order operators. It cost a year of my life learning about these things because that's not what my training was in originally. But in the end, we proved rigorously existence, uniqueness, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to skip all that now, since otherwise we'll be here all day, and just go to an example. So this example is the same one I looked at before, the stochastic heteroclinic oscillator, but now we're asking for the mean return time based phase instead of the asymptotic phase. We set up this computational domain. We solve the mean return time equation. We have an arbitrary cut along this vertical line. And so you see the solution jumps across there. So here's where the cut was. But you can take the isochrons, calculate the mod, the period, and so you get these perfectly smooth, nice isochrons, which look, gosh, they look a lot like these isochrons. So these are from the complex part of the backward operator, the eigenfunction of the backward operator. These come from solving the backward operator with this inhomogeneous boundary condition and this funny jump boundary condition. And so I'll have to skip this part of the story. It turns out they're very similar, but they're not identical. Like, the equations defining them have some small terms that are a little bit different, which we don't really understand, but they don't seem to make much difference in terms of like the shape of the isochron. Whether they make a difference in terms of long-term synchronization or entrainment properties, which is the right one to use for defining the phase response curve and so on, those are all nice open problems that would be fun to solve. Just to confirm that our analysis works, we can take a cut like Schwabedal and Pikovsky did along these two different directions, and compare them. So the red one is a spoke, a straight line spoke, and this blue one is one of the isochrons. And we start a bunch of initial conditions. From the isochron, you get a mean return time that's uniform. If you take that spoke, that's a straight line, then you get totally different return times. So it works the same way that it did with Schwabedal and Pikovsky. Okay, so yeah, as usual, the introduction took the whole time. So I'll stop for questions, but your question might be like, I want to know about the variance of interspike intervals, or it might be like, I want to know about a noisy spiral sink. So I can jump now to either of those two things, or we can just talk about the weather, whatever you prefer. I see in the chat there is, I want to know about the variance. That's Jan Hendrik. Okay. Does Jan Hendrik get a vote? This is not his
Absolutely,
seminar,
yeah.
but
I'm on
okay,
board with
good.
that.
So thank you, Jan Hendrik. Let me find it then. All right. So, right, part of this is published, part of this is unpublished. And this is, I should have mentioned the stuff with the PDE. That was work that a lot of which was done by my master's student, Alexander Kao at Case Western Reserve, who moved on to a PhD program at Northwestern. And what I'm going to talk about now is with my PhD student, Shusen Pu, who is just defended his thesis last Friday, and he is ready to be hired as your postdoc. So if you want to talk about that more, contact me offline. Okay, so Hodgkin Huxley. Many of us are familiar with the standard Hodgkin Huxley, which is a system of 4 coupled ordinary differential equations. 1 is for the voltage, and 3 are for these gating variables, M, N, and H. There's an equivalent picture, which is an underlying Markov process where the N gate, if you remember the Hodgkin Huxley equations, you have n to the 4th. That's because there are 4 different end gates that each have a probability of opening or closing independently, and they all have to be open. So n to the 4th is the probability that they're all open. But you can also represent the state of the potassium channel as being on this 5-node graph where you move back and forth as a Markov process with transition rates that are dependent on the voltage. And then the fraction, if you have a population of channels, the fraction of channels in this state is what dictates the conductance of the potassium channel. Likewise, for the sodium channel, you've got M and H, 3 M gates and 1 H gate, and so they all have to be in the permissive configuration. So you have this 8-state channel state transition graph. I looked at this and said, each of these individual transitions we can think of as an independent noise source. And if we write down the Langevin equation for the ion channel population, taking into account each of these independent transitions, of which there are there's 20 edges here and 8 edges here, so 28 different independent noise sources, then we can write down a system of equations like this. Here's the Hodgkin Huxley voltage or current balance equation. You got your leak current, your sodium, and your potassium currents, and they're gated by what fraction of channels, or actually how many channels are in the 8th state there, or the 5th state here. And then the channel state obeys a Langevin equation. If you have a large population, use a Gaussian approximation, then the noise coefficients are the flux along each of those edges times an independent Gaussian variable. So you got 20 independent Gaussian white noise variables for sodium and 8 for potassium. And then you've got this 8x20 matrix here and a 5x8 matrix here. And so we have a paper that's just coming out this month in Neural Computation. They liked it so much they put this figure from the paper on the cover, which is very nice. I won't explain too much about what that is so that we don't go over time. But the point is that we have an explicit model with white noise, which is in the form of the models I was talking about before with the mean return time. So you can ask, let me go back to this figure here because it'll help explain. Oops, this figure back here. Okay, so if you have a setup like this, so now we have a 14-dimensional space, not a 2-dimensional space. There's still an annular structure because there's a region in the middle that the probability is exceedingly unlikely to visit. So we can put a hole through our 14-dimensional space, and we can construct the phase variable by solving the. We don't explicitly solve the partial differential equation in 14 dimensions because that's too difficult to do, I think. But conceptually or formally, we can define the mean return time phase as a function where you take a slice, you go around once, you come back to that slice through the 14-dimensional space, and the mean return time is uniform no matter where you are. We call those the isochron surface, the mean return time isochron surfaces, and they don't align exactly with the voltage. So if you ask for the interspike interval, the cell is firing, and then every time it crosses a certain voltage, it fires again. That's also a slice through this 14-dimensional space, but it's not a slice that's parallel to the isochron. Okay. In this picture, if I can calculate the mean time to go around, there's a similar expression for the second moment of the time to go around. The inhomogeneous term is not 1, but it shows up with something involving the mean. So we can numerically or analytically think about the variance, or the second moment, and from that the variance of the time it takes to go around in the same framework. And so, all right, so long story short, when we do that, we end up using something called Dinkin's theorem, which tells you how an observable evolves in time. So you could be anything. For us, it's going to be the second moment, either the first moment or the second moment of the time until the next crossing of an isochron. And it's the expected value of whatever that observable is equal to the original value plus the expectation under the probability distribution starting from that initial point and then spreading around the expectation of the integral from 0 up to the time when I hit that surface, which is a stopping time, which is a, we can't get into what stopping times are, but anyway, the mean return, the actual return time is a random time. I integrate up until that time. And the thing I integrate is the backwards operator acting on this, which in the case of the variance, or the second moment, we know what this is and we can calculate it. And so that gives us an expression for not the variance of the inner spike interval, but the variance of the time to get from one isochron back to the same isochron, which if the isochron surface and the voltage surface are not too different, or if the noise is not too large, then we don't see the difference very much, then that's an approximation for the inner spike interval variance. So the variance in the time from the isochron around to the isochron has this form. So the cool thing is it can be written in the limit of small noise. So if the noise isn't too large, in a linear decomposition where each of the different transitions in this noise matrix, each of the 28 different independent noise sources makes a separate additive identifiable contribution to the variance of the return time, the inner isochron return time. I should point out that Jan Hendrik has a very similar expression in his PhD thesis, which is why he's here. This isn't made explicitly, but what he does have is a sort of, as you go around the cycle, you are constantly accumulating variance until the next spike. And so there's a nice expression. What we've done is sort of figure out analytically what that expression looks like in terms of the underlying channel kinetics. I think that's a fair way to put it. Okay, so we can use that. We can calculate that integral numerically when the noise is small. It gives us a good approximation. And so here you have the inner spike interval variance on a log scale. Sorry, this is the inner spike interval variance, where what we've done is we've shut off the noise on all but one of the 28 edges, one by one. And you see that, sure enough, the variance increases linearly until it gets large enough that you start missing spikes, you start getting nonlinear effects, and then it zooms up to a sort of a plateau. So there's a nice big region where the linear approximation works. This idea of only incorporating certain of the noise sources is called stochastic shielding, the stochastic shielding approximation. That's a whole separate talk to go through all of that. But the point is, if you look at this, you can see if I've got modest amounts of noise, so like this is scaling the size of the population. 0 is kind of the reference value, and at that point, I can pretty much ignore the effects of all but 2 of the ion channels, or maybe all but 4 of the ion channel, all but 4 of the individual transitions. So instead of a 28 noise source simulation, I could have almost exactly the same results using just either a 2 noise source or 4 or 6 noise source simulation. So you get a dramatic increase in computational efficiency from stochastic shielding. And right, okay, so it works. I should finish. The last cool thing, oh, I see, it is 11 o'clock. So one of the things that we discovered along the way, and this is now unpublished, we're hoping to submit this very soon, is that because the isochron is not exactly parallel to the voltage slice, if you calculate the inner spike interval variance of a nerve cell using 1 voltage as the criterion for when a spike happens, or using a different voltage for the criterion of when the spike happens, you don't get the same inner spike interval variance. The inner spike interval variance is something that people measure as if it was a real thing, but it's not a real thing. It's a subjective quantity that is dependent on the voltage that you use in your Schmidt trigger for detecting spikes. The same cell, the same recording gives you different interspike interval variances depending on whether you set the spike at 0 millivolts, negative 50 millivolts, etc. And the reason is because the isochron surface is not exactly parallel to the voltage surface. If you take an isochron surface, or you take a different isochron surface, or you take a different isochron surface, they all have the same variance. It just falls right out of Dinkin's formula. So it doesn't matter which surface you take. You get the same accumulated variance as you go around one cycle. So the variance of the interphase interval distribution is a true invariant of the system, but the variance of the interspike interval is not an invariance. This has never been published as far as I know. Nobody has ever pointed this out before, probably because the effect is small. We're talking about a change of maybe at most 5% in the variance, which for noisy experiments, that's small enough people wouldn't have noticed. But from a mathematical point of view, I think it's pretty darn interesting. It's even true for real experimental data, not just artificial data. So this is data from my collaborator at Case Western in the neuroscience department, Dr. David Friel. He records from Purkinje cells. He records long traces of Purkinje cells with a constant current clamp. And the variance, if you take his data and you set the threshold at negative 20 versus negative 45, you get a consistent pattern where the variance gets larger the higher the voltage, which is also, we don't have a great explanation for that yet. Why should it be increasing instead of decreasing? And of course, with the simulations, you can also see what the phase is, and then it matches. Okay, that's the end of that story. I hope that's enough for Jan Hendrik and everybody else. And I will, I will stop there. These are some of the papers that you can look up if you want. But we're over time, so I will, that's good. I'll stick around if people have questions after everyone else has gone out to the cookies and punch.
Well, thank you very much for such a wonderful talk. So please feel free to ask any questions if anyone wants to add more.
Or you can leave and nobody will notice because it just changes the number of participants.
For the going back to the isochrons, does the gradient of the just like in the deterministic case, does the gradient actually tell you something about phase responses? And then once you have a phase response, if you have a perturbation that shifts the phase of a stochastic oscillator, I imagine it's not sustained for a very long time. So what would phase response mean in this case?
Right. So I've been puzzling over that for a while, and I don't have an unambiguous answer yet. But okay, so I can say a couple of things. If you, this is all stuff that we haven't published yet because we don't feel like we have a complete story. If I take a system, so if I have a noisy oscillator and it's sitting at the equilibrium distribution, so it's been spinning around for a while, and now I just give it a kick, right? So I give it a volt, I inject a small current in the usual way, and I shift the voltage. If I want to know what the new isochron is compared to the old isochron, well then of course I am looking at the gradient of the isochron function. I have two candidates for what that isochron function is. One is the solution of this PDE, the other is the solution of this eigenvalue problem. Either way, I can talk about its gradient, and that would tell me how an instantaneous current impulse would shift me along the voltage axis, and then how that would change the phase. What it doesn't tell me is so the sort of questions that we answer using phase response curves would be, all right, take two cells like this and couple them together. So every time one crosses some Poincare section, it fires a spike that gives the other one a kick, or they're coupled through some continuous coupling, either way. So now the motion of one shifts the phase of the other and vice versa. and they're gradually going to entrain. Now, you're not going to get one-to-one like entrainment that's perfect where they're totally synchronized, right? What you're going to have is the joint probability density for both of them is going to become concentrated along the diagonal or something like that, right? You'll have to describe the synchronized state in terms of the joint distribution of the two set of oscillator variables. And if you can effectively reduce that to a description in terms of the joint distribution of the two phase variables, then you've accomplished, your phase reduction. And the phase variables together satisfy some Fokker-Planck equation, et cetera. So where the coupling would show up in that equation. So how are the eigenfunctions of the Fokker-Planck equation for the phase of the two coupled oscillators related to the eigenfunctions of the individual oscillators separately? And then you have to take products of eigenfunctions and stuff to see what the interactions look like. But I think something like that should be possible. In the case that the noise is very small, I mean, let's say sufficiently small, then the classical picture should emerge somehow, right? So if the noise is pretty small and the oscillators are nice and stable, then you should have sort of like a little traveling packet, like a little Gaussian packet of phase traveling around. And those two packets should get synchronized with each other. And so the joint distribution should then be very tight. And maybe you could, asymptotically in the small phase limit, describe that in a way that looks a lot like, so the gradient of the phase function will show up, as the leading term in those small noise limits and so on. So, I mean, I think it's a pretty rich set of problems just because, you have to adapt all of the classical machinery to this stochastic framework, but I don't think there's a fundamentally insurmountable problem. And to test things, you have to run lots of simulations because it's stochastic. So you have to be prepared to sort of run 10,000 simulations, whereas before you would only have had to run one. And so its progress is a little bit slower.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, do we have any more questions?
Yeah, Peter.
Anybody else out there working on stochastic oscillators of any sort?
Peter,
always looking for new examples.
I would have one question. Hello.
Jan Hendrik,
Yeah.
Welcome.
Hey, so this is lovely stuff. I mean, it's like everything of this talk, but I would have a question to the first part, actually, where you introduced phases in systems where we previously thought that there wouldn't be a phase description. So in the deterministic days, basically, if you had something like a subcritical Hopf bifurcation, so you had a spiral in the middle, you had an unstable limit cycle, and you had a stable limit cycle around it. So people would call basically everything that's inside the unstable limit cycle, this is like a phaseless set, right? It's kind of like a black hole where you don't have a phase description. Now, what you've shown is that there is a perfectly nice phase description there. So the thing that I think one can postulate is that actually the phase description is somewhat sort of continuous. So it's sort of like you have a phase in the middle, but it actually kind of matches or is remembered or is linked to the phase description of the deterministic limit cycle outside and sort of crosses the unstable limit cycle. And I mean, the reason why that is because we actually know that these phases in the middle are actually remembered because you can see them in the ISI distribution, right? And they're sometimes multimodal. You can see the subthreshold oscillations even in the ISI histograms. So this is all somehow you must get the whole continuum range of phases to agree with each other. And I think actually your method is even applicable to unstable limit cycles. I think it actually doesn't really matter. You can use your, I mean, previously you needed a stable limit cycle to define the asymptotic phase, but with noise you can also nicely define it for an unstable limit cycle. Is that right?
Okay, so I think I'm going to pull two questions out of what you said and answer both of them. One is in the case where you have, suppose you're near a subcritical Hopf bifurcation and there's a stable deterministic, stable spiral sink, but there's also coexisting with that large amplitude spikes. So you have this in Hodgkin Huxley, for example.
Yeah.
Now, if you include channel noise or whatever source of noise you like, we looked at a system unpublished because you know, the story, as usual, is not complete. But when we took the, I think it was the sodium, the Itzikevich persistent sodium potassium model, which is the one for which I developed the eigenfunction stuff, and changed the parameter so it was in that range near the subcritical Hopf bifurcation. It violated the assumption that I made at the beginning of, where's my assumption? It violated this assumption of having only one eigenmode that was clearly the slowest decaying eigenmode. What happened was there were two complex conjugate pairs that would like trade places, one of which was had an imaginary part that was close to the frequency of the spiral sink, and one of which had a imaginary part that was close to the frequency of the large amplitude limit cycle. So, you know, intuitively or heuristically, you see a mixture of both oscillations. And of course, pathwise, you see subthreshold oscillations and then the large amplitude and then subthreshold. And the stationary distribution, or the approach to stationary distribution, is a combination of two different oscillatory modes with similar decay rates, but different frequencies. So it fits perfectly, and it's all smooth, right? You smooth as you vary parameters like the current or something. One becomes more prominent, the other becomes less prominent. So it's a beautiful framework for doing that. We haven't systematically. If you would like to work together on exploring that, I think that's a good problem, and it would be a nice illustration of the method. Now, for the asymptotic method, for the mean return time, it's trickier because where do you like I could have one Poincare section that's like catching the small amplitude traversal, the small amplitude oscillations, and then maybe put a boundary around that, and I had crossed that boundary, and now I'm doing the large amplitude one. So I would start to carve up my domain in a complicated way, perhaps, or I just take a single Poincare section, but then I would see a mixture. You know, the mean time would be reflecting two different things happening that have different means, and so that picture might not work as well. I think that was one question. The other question was, I have to remember what it was. The last part of what you said.
No, I think that was the major point, and also that you could actually use this phase description to basically describe the phases of unstable limit cycles, right? I mean,
I'm sorry, that was unstable. So okay, so there's an interesting comment about unstable limit cycles. So our operator, we have the forward operator and the backward operator, both. Everything seems to revolve around the backwards operator. Why the emphasis on the backward operator when the forward operator also has eigenfunctions? It has the same eigenvalues. Those eigenfunctions are complex. They have a phase as well. And in fact, I might even have included a slide here. Oh, I did. Yeah. So I don't usually show this slide because it's pretty messy. But the black curve is the isochrons for a deterministic ordinary differential equations model. This is the Itzikevich's sodium and potassium model. It's like Morris-Lacar, a two-variable model. You know, they wind around, and the deterministic ones spiral a lot when you get near the fixed point in a sort of complicated way because there's oscillator death there. The red curves show the numerically calculated or estimated phase from the asymptotic behavior of the backwards operator. And they are similar in shape to the black curves. They spiral in kind of the same way. There's more noise, so they are not as tightly curled. The pitch is reduced because the noise kind of smooths things out. So if you look in detail, the black ones curve more sharply than the red ones. This zigzaggy stuff, I don't completely understand. I would like to understand it better, but it lies along the voltage null line. And so it looks like the shapes of the Hermite eigenfunction locally, Hermite eigenfunctions you would get if you just had dVdt equals minus V minus fixed point, and then you try to write down the master equation for that. So that's interesting. But the blue curves, which are all messed up, are the level curves for the phase of the forward operator. And they run in the, like they curve the wrong way. They all curve in the opposite way. And the forward operator is only well-defined, or the eigenfunction is only well-defined when you are, where the density is not zero. So out here, the density is almost zero. And so you're asking for the complex argument of a number that's very close to zero. And so you get basically numerical noise. So it's poorly defined out here. You see the jump discontinuity where it crosses 2 pi, but it curves in the opposite direction. If you take the heteroclinic channel, the stable heteroclinic planar system, you can calculate the forward and backward phases, and they just curve in opposite directions. Reason I'm pointing all this out is because you asked about unstable oscillators. When we focus on stable limit cycles, we break the time symmetry between future and past in the way we define the phase. Because the way we define the phase is, give me points in the past, which would have done the same thing in the future. If I have an unstable limit cycle, that question doesn't really work because points in the past are moving away. But I can ask the reverse question. I can say, give me points in the future, which would have given come from the same points in the past, if it's an unstable oscillator, switching the roles of time, forward and backward time, and exchanging the eigenfunctions of the forward operator and the backwards operator. So if you're looking at, if you want to define the quote unquote asymptotic phase of an unstable limit cycle, I would try using the level curves of the complex argument of the forward operator rather than the backward operator. This is kind of just a hunch. I mean, I haven't shown that rigorously. And if it's an unstable oscillator, then how do you even have a stationary distribution to begin with? This all assumes that you have a stationary distribution and so on. So there's some conceptual problems there. But generally speaking, this forward versus backwards asymmetry has to do with the fact that we've chosen to focus on stable, which is choosing a direction of time where things are converging. So interesting question. Okay.
Thanks a lot. That's cool.
Alrighty, I guess we'll finish here for today. So thanks, Peter, again for giving such a wonderful
thanks for sticking
talk.
around, Ying.
No worries.
Thank
and
you,
also
young man.
everyone.
Good to see you, and good to see you, Jan Hendrik.
Yep.
Alrighty, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.